So we're ready for another
For more
podcast
information about
with
Revival
Pastor Carl Smith and
GPS,
Dr. Billy
please visit our
McLeod.
website at
And how are you guys doing?
revivalgps.com. Please subscribe to our channel,
Good,
share
thank
the
you,
video, like it,
Dubai.
and
Quite
leave us a
cold here
comment. You can
South
also
Africa,
support our
but
ministry by
we
donating.
are healthy and
All the
warm,
information
so
is
we are
in our
fine, thank
website.
you.
Thank you and
And
God
staying
bless.
out of trouble. Great stuff.
Our
Yes,
cold
yeah.
is not your cold.
No, not at all, not at all. I mean, yeah, we go camping when it's minus 20. So, so today we will be discussing Revelation 11. And prior to starting the podcast, we sort of touched on a couple of points, and there's quite a few things to unpack. But the most important thing or interesting thing for me about Revelation 11 is the two witnesses. But again, let's start from scratch and at or on verse 1. So, Willie, the temple of God, measuring the temple of God, the altar.
Yeah,
What
so I can
are they referring to?
I can first just mention that when we get to verse 14, we read that the second woe is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly. Now, the second woe, we know that was the sixth trumpet. So this whole passage is still part of the sixth trumpet. It's the second part we've already discussed in some detail in chapter 9, this trumpet, but now this is sort of, I would say, a commentary on what has already been said and described. So what was first described was all these, we've seen that these strange creatures and so forth. We won't go back there. But this is a kind of, I would say, a commentary on things that's related to what's happening or what will happen during or after the sixth trumpet has blown. We've already seen, that the kind of creatures that appeared, which was like horses and like described as, in a certain sense, looking like lions, all sorts of descriptions. But very much it seemed to me, and in our discussion, it also came out that a war or aspects of a war or military wear or something was being depicted and in that passage. So when we get to chapter 11, we see that we read that the prophet or John was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel said, "Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar and those who worship there. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months." So here we have definitely have a description that's related to what we've discussed previously. It seems that Jerusalem will play a central role in the events that's described in this trumpet, under the sixth trumpet. Jerusalem, and what is more, is that the city, it seems that the city will be captured, or that these heathen nations will in some way have power over the city. They will occupy the city. And so when we read that the temple is to be measured, but not the court outside the temple, because it's been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot. And slightly later on, we will come back to that, we read about that beast. In this case, it's called the beast that descends out of the bottomless pit. We've seen in the previous discussion that it's called an angel that arises out of the bottomless pit. It's the king of all those beings that appear on the scene. And he is definitely involved here, because he's again referred to. He's the one that kills the two witnesses. the two witnesses. And so this is definitely closely related to the first part of the description of this sixth trumpet that we find in chapter 9. And so this is just a continuation. In a certain sense, chapter 10 is just a short break where St. John just gets this book that he had to eat. And it was bitter. We have already discussed it. And the bitterness reflects these bitter times and these woes and these terrible things that will happen. So it's just very much part of this same kind of thing that we are focusing on in this part of the prophecy. So in my view, what is extremely important here is the reference to the Gentiles and these people that will tread the holy city underfoot. And to me, that implies that it's a war that's been spoken of. Jerusalem has been taken, and it's a very bad situation, time of persecution. We've already seen, for example, in chapter 7, the reference was made to the Great Tribulation and the multitudes that will die during the period of the Great Tribulation. And it seems that this, especially in terms of the land of Israel and Jerusalem, that this will play a center role in those events. What is also interesting is the measuring rod. We find the same thing in Ezekiel, in the prophet Ezekiel, where a measuring rod is given to the prophet and he measures the temple in the same way that we find here. And in that case, it's from chapter 40 till chapter 48. And it seems that the reference to the measuring rod may be, it's quite possible that it is a prophetic description of the fact that the temple will be rebuilt. Because we do read that he must rise and measure the temple of God. The altar, but not the area outside, not the courtyard. So there's, I think, quite a possibility that this prophecy also refers to the temple that will be rebuilt during this period when these events take place. So it's not something that we can say for sure, but I think that what is implied here is that the temple will be rebuilt. And that actually comes back to another passage that we find in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And there we read about this man of sin that will appear, and he's will be revealed. He's a son of perdition. In many ways, he seems to be a similar or the same figure than the one that we're discussing that rises from the bottomless pit. And we read that he opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So this is in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. So here we read that he'll sit in the temple as God and, claiming to be God and requiring worship. And this also, together with the verse in chapter 11 that we are discussing, seems to imply that the temple will be rebuilt. And this means, since the temple has not yet been rebuilt, and the measurements of the temple seems to imply in a prophetic sense that it will be rebuilt, that these things will still have to, has not yet happened, and is still to come, are still to come, yeah.
Carel, anything to add?
Yes, thank you, Lebay. What is interesting for me about this chapter is specific locations seem to be mentioned and also specific orientation in time. What we read in the previous chapters seem to be more general, although if you read clearly, you can see it is applied to Jerusalem and Israel, some of these chapters, but here it is very clearly, we also read of a temple and the holy city, but it is clearly not in heaven, it's on earth. And then, as Willie mentioned, thank you, Willie, I never understood it that way, but it makes a lot of sense when you talk about that measuring rod, which implies the rebuilding of the temple, and which has been a discussion. And, you know, in Israel, the Jews want to rebuild the temple, and yeah, it's a very live topic going on even in our day. But then these periods of time given, verse 3, and I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth, which is 3.5 years. And that is really a key time period if we read it in different prophetic books of the Bible. So I'm sure we will talk a little bit more about that time period. But also what I was wondering about these 2 witnesses, I'm not sure you know, who they will be, but it seems it will be people, servants of the Lord, powerfully anointed by His Spirit. We read, if anyone, verse 5, would harm them, this is how he is doomed and killed. Fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. And all that happens to these, what they do and what happens to them, they, in the end, the beast from the bottomless pit war against them, conquer them, but then they arise from the dead again and taken into heaven. So these are really 2 amazing, magnificent witnesses. I don't know, Lebay or Willie, if you have some more information, what we can think about who they will be.
Yeah, I think to come back to before answering that question, Carel, I think we can just say something more about the 42 months. The Holy City will be tread underfoot for 42 months. And then you've mentioned they will prophecy, that's the 2 witnesses will prophecy for 1,260 days. Now, those 2 are exactly the same period of time. As you've mentioned, it's 3.5 years. And in the next chapter, actually, we read that it's called a time, times, and half a time. So that means a year, 2 years, and a half year. So that's 3.5 years. Now, this is extremely important because this connects this prophecy, as you've mentioned, with especially the prophecies in the book of Daniel. Now, in the book of Daniel, in chapter 7, we're not going to discuss the book of Daniel in any depth in this series of lectures. We're only going to just look at some aspects that's clearly related. But here we read about a certain beast. It's called the 4th beast. And we read in chapter 7, verse 23, he shall devour the whole earth, trample and break it in pieces. Now that's quite interesting because this angel of the bottomless pit, or the beast that rises from the bottomless pit, we've already seen that his name, Apollyon, Abaddon, means the destroyer, the one that destroys. So this is very much what we read about this last beast in Daniel chapter 7. And we read as he has 10 horns and so forth, and he has a kingdom. And then we read quite a few things, but what we read about him is, let me just get to verse 25. And he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law, Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. So here we have exactly this the same expression that we find in chapter 12, the next chapter in Revelation. So this is the same period we're talking about. And then we again find a reference to this period in Daniel chapter 9. And this is the chapter or the passage that refers to the period of 70 weeks. Now, the week here is actually a week of years. So it's 7 years. So it's 70 times 7 years, 490 years that's referred to. And then here in this passage, a reference is made to the last week. And then we read something here. Let me just see chapter 9, verse 27. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, that's after 3.5 years. So again, 3.5 years is important. So this last part of the week of the 7 years is again 3.5 years. And in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, who will destroy. So again, we read about the destroyer, and we read about the wing of abominations. And this reference to the abominations is something that's extremely important, because reference is again made to this, for example, in the prophecy, Jesus' prophecy in Matthew chapter 24, in the prophetic discourse. And then we read that this will, the prophecy is not easy to understand, but I will just continue reading, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. So he will make desolate, he will destroy, he's a great destroyer. On the wing of abominations, it's been also, I see some other translations as it, the wing of the temple will be abominations. So the wing here, it's strange to try and understand what the reference is made to here, but it seems most likely that the temple is what is actually referred to. Now, let me just read to you what we find in Matthew chapter 24. We read, and therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, that's the temple, he says, whosoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And then he continues like this, and then he says, in those days there will be a great tribulation as had never been before. Now this is actually taken from Daniel chapter 12, the beginning of Daniel chapter 12. And in this same chapter, again, reference is made to a period, this period of a time, times, and half a time. Chapter 12, verse 7. It shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. So the power of the holy people, it seems that the reference is here to Israel, especially when one also take the previous chapter in consideration, chapter 11. But let's just go back to the beginning of the chapter. It says that at that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And we'll see in the next chapter, in chapter 12 in Revelation, it's against that again that reference is made to him. And there shall be a time of trouble, difficult times, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. So what we find is the reference to this period, a time, times, and half a time, is repeated 3 times throughout the book of Daniel. It's always in reference to hardships and terrible times that the people of Israel will be in. And therefore, it makes sense that in the book of Revelation, it's the situation, the context is in Jerusalem. And what is also important is that, especially in chapter 7, two things I can mention. The one is this, what is also referred to in the book of Revelation, of Matthew, in Matthew, where he makes reference to the abomination of desolation. This abomination, that is extremely important, this thing that will happen. And what is also important is that we've seen in chapter 7, there will be a certain, he also calls it the beast in chapter 7, and that he will persecute the saints, and he will do that for a time, times, and half a time. So the idea of great persecution, and in the case of Matthew 24, we also read it's the great tribulation, greatest of all, as there had never been and will never be again. So this is really the great tribulation, and this beast that will persecute the saints. So all these things are clearly referred to when we get to chapter 11 in Revelation. This is the undertones. This is the reason for referring to 42 months and 1,260 days, 3.5 years, is to connect this passage with these other passages in Daniel. Now, in the case of the book of Daniel, this prophecy in the first place refers to things that happened before the time of Christ, in the period of the Maccabees, when Jerusalem was taken by the Syrians, and in the temple, a temple was built for Zeus, the Greek god Zeus, and a pig was offered on that temple. It was really abomination for the people of Israel. But this is not only to be understood in historical context, because Jesus says that these things still lies in the future. So there's a multiple prophecy that we're talking about. And I think this is very, very important. We can't read the book of Revelation without taking this background into account. So when we read these numbers, about this particular period, as Carel has mentioned, we should remember that this is the background for this passage. And this is why when we read that the court of the temple should not be measured but left out, because we read that the nations will be in Jerusalem, and as we've seen, they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. Clearly, this is the period of persecution, difficult times, and it's related to the 2 witnesses that's killed. They are also killed by this beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit. So clearly, all these events, these things happening in Jerusalem, within the framework of what we're discussing here, is not to be disconnected from the other prophecies where these same themes appear. So I just wanted to bring that into the conversation.
That was an amazing discussion. Really.
So it's clear we cannot read Revelation without Daniel, the book of Daniel.
Absolutely. You have to have them side by side. And then, Carel, with regard to your question, that's actually really interesting. My personal opinion, I don't know what Willie says about this, is that I don't think we know who the 2 witnesses are now. I know in Jewish tradition, they seem to think that it's Moses and Elijah, because of the fact that they were Moses basically, it's the ability to turn water into blood, and then with Elijah, the power to destroy with fire. So it just sort of refers to 2 Kings verse 1 and Exodus 7. But there's another tradition that seems to think it should be Enoch and Elijah, because they were taken up to heaven without actually dying. But I'm curious to hear Willie's opinion on that.
Yeah, so again, the 2 olive trees, this is taken from the book of Zechariah, chapter 4. And we read here, and the 2 olive trees by it next to the candlestick that we read about in this passage. One upon the right side of the bell and the other upon the left side thereof. So here we have reference to these two olive trees. And in this case, the two olive trees refers to Zerubbabel and to Joshua. Those two main figures that was the ones that was involved with the building of the temple, the rebuilding of the temple. So it's quite interesting. The reference to these two olive trees clearly imply that the rebuilding of the temple, about which we have just had some discussion, is clearly again still in the picture. And these two other figures are Zerubbabel and Joshua, the two important figures from that time. Now, I do understand that the reason why people would like to see these people, for example, as a reference to, for example, Enoch, or which has gone to heaven without dying, or for example, Elijah and John the Baptist, because we do read here what they will do is they will, we read that they will, for example, fire will proceed from their mouth and there was their enemies. That sounds very much like what happened in the case of Elijah. And anyone who wants to harm them must be killed in that manner. That's exactly what happened with him when those people came. The king sent those people and fire from heaven burned them. And then we read, and these have power to shut heaven so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy. That's also what happened in the time of Elijah. And then we read that they have the power over waters to turn them to blood. Now that's Moses. So that means one can understand why Moses and Elijah is mentioned in this context. But my feeling, my view on this actually, is that in the same way that Zerubbabel and Joshua was the two figures referred to originally in reference to the two olive trees or two lampstands, that this is again two prominent figures in the end of time that will live in that period when the temple is rebuilt and will resist the beast that rises from the bottomless pit. And that's why he will kill them. It will be in that period. And I think we should again take this background into consideration, where this reference to the two olive trees, two lampstands, actually first occur in the book of Zechariah.
Yeah, maybe, when John the Baptist, it is said Elijah will prepare the way for the Messiah. And then John the Baptist arrived. He was not Elijah. He was a man of his time.
Yes, exactly.
But he had that kind of ministry. So, yes, Willie, it makes a lot of sense when you say in the end times, this will probably be servants of the Lord with this kind of ministry and the same kind of anointing, resisting the Antichrist.
And we do read that John came in the spirit and power of Elijah.
That's right.
So I think most likely these two persons will also come in the spirit and power of Elijah and maybe Moses. Elijah and Moses was also the two that appeared to Jesus on the mountain. So it's quite possible, but I don't think they will be the two persons. I think it will be two persons living during that period.
Right.
And then we read that they will be, let me just read chapter 11, verse 7. When they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. So this is in Jerusalem. These things happen in Jerusalem, as we have already seen. Then those from the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations, all those peoples all across the world, that venerates the beast that arose from the bottomless pit, as we'll see in the next 2 chapters when we get there to discuss that. They will not allow their bodies to be put into graves, and those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them, make merry, and send gifts to one another, because these 2 prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. So it's a nice picture of the setting in Jerusalem.
And Willie, I can just add, I think the big thing with this as well is the fact that they will not be buried. And in Jewish tradition, if someone dies, they basically bury them within 1 day, and that's a sign of respect.
Exactly.
And so they're being disrespected. The other thing that I find interesting is the reference to Sodom and Egypt. And in my mind, Sodom stands for sexual immorality and Egypt for slavery. So it's a great city that those are the 2 identifying characteristics. Yeah.
But it also, I can see in it something of Revelation. You read that in the end times, those who are holy will become more holy, and those who are evil will become more evil. So it seems that the powers of light and darkness are intensified, and the beast is operating. But these 2 anointed servants of the Lord are anointed with tremendous power in the end times. So you see the clash of light and darkness very clearly in this scenario.
Yeah, and then after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered the 2 witnesses. They stood on their feet. And we read that a great fear fell on those who saw them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying, "Come up here." And they ascended to heaven in a cloud, and the enemies saw them. There was a great earthquake. 10th of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed. So this will be a terrible, terrible period. But within this, during this terrible times, and in this situation, God actually resurrects them after 3.5 days, and they go up to heaven. And this time, not like John, that was also taken, also called to come to heaven, where he saw in a vision these things that's happening. In this case, it seems in the prophecy that they would really go to heaven in the same way that Jesus went to heaven.
Even as Elijah went back to heaven.
Exactly.
That same idea once again.
Elijah and Enoch. That's also why they are presumably mentioned in this regard.
And then the kingdoms of the world becomes the kingdoms of our Lord.
So then after...
Sorry, Willie.
Sorry?
Somewhere where Satan says these kingdoms are all mine when Jesus was tempted. When his ministry started. But there will come a time that the Lord has reversed that, and that he has taken the kingdoms of the world back.
So I think what is also important is that we read here that after the 6th trumpet has sounded, we read that the 7th trumpet was also sounded. And when the 7th trumpet sounded, we read in this passage that there were loud voices in heaven, and we read, as you've said, the kingdoms of this world has become the kingdoms of our Lord and his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. But I don't believe that this is actually the moment when these things has finally happened. It just says that it has come. The moment when these things can become a reality has occurred. But there's still certain things that must happen. For example, we read, in chapter 18, that the nations were angry and your wrath has come. So I believe that the wrath that is referred to here is what we actually read about later on in chapter 16 when we read about the 7 bowls. So in the same way that we had the 7 seals, or remember the book of prophecy in its totality was sealed with 7 seals. And when the seventh seal were opened, we found that there were 7 trumpets. And now we find with the 7th trumpet, after the 7th trumpet, which is part of the 7th seal, which is actually telling us all these things that will happen, the prophecies that's contained in this book, we will come to the 7 bells, this terrible events of the wrath of God. And we'll discuss it in due time and some other events that's related. So I personally think that this is actually an announcement that with the sounding of the 7th angel, it's announced that God's victory is on hand. It's not far, it's not long, because he will take the reign and will rule. But I do not think within the flow of events in the book of Revelation that this happens at this moment that he takes up his reign. I think he only takes up his reign as we read in chapter 20. So this is actually just saying that the moment has come for him to take up his reign over the kingdoms of the world. That is how I read it and understand it. Yeah.
And then in verse 19, the verse says, then God's temple in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the ark of his covenant. And there came flashes of lightning, rumbling, spirals of thunder, and earthquake, and a severe hailstorm.
Yeah, and this is also repeated again in chapters 15, 16 now. Yeah.
But how should we understand that the ark of the covenant is in heaven?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, when Moses actually built the tabernacle, then the Lord told him, do everything according to the vision that you saw in heaven. So when you read through the book of Revelation, I think that many of the things, the descriptions in heaven, is actually in accordance with what we read about those events pertaining to Moses. It's the heavenly model that was duplicated on earth. So this is the heavenly temple, I believe, that's been referred to. And the ark, this is in heaven, in my opinion. It's not on earth.
Yes, it says heaven. Thank you.
Yeah, he actually says here, was open in heaven.
It does,
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Any final comments, Carel?
No, Willie has really done a deep study of the book of Daniel. And that clearly gives us a much better explanation of this chapter and many other chapters in Revelation. So once again, it proves that the Bible explains itself, but you cannot read any chapter of the Bible, especially prophecy, in isolation. The better you know the Old Testament and all those prophecies, the stronger your foundation will be to understand the New Testament and especially the book of Revelation. So thank you, Willie, for that deep study of the book of Daniel.
Yeah, and in the next discussion, we will actually in chapters 12 and 13, we will see that this is just a continuation of the things that we've been talking about. It's not just going into much more detail. The great dragon that appears in heaven, the great fiery red dragon, and then the beast that we read about, that's been described in great detail in chapter 13. So these are just focusing on the events that we have been being discussed. That's just in much more detail. Focus on the main characters
like we
of
zoom
the story.
in,
Yeah.
Zooming in on it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, Willie, what will we be looking at next week?
Yeah, so I believe our next discussion will be chapter 12. So today we discussed chapter 11, and we try to do a chapter each time, or at least a theme within a chapter. So I believe that next week will be the red the great fiery red dragon. Yeah.
That's a very popular chapter in Revelation.
Yeah, and also the woman, the identity of the woman.
Yeah. Great stuff. That sounds intriguing. I hope everybody else finds that intriguing as well. And like Carel said, that's a very topical, thing in Revelation. But thank you very much, Willie, for your time and this. I mean, just an excellent overview and discussion. I really enjoyed that, and for your input as well, Carel. It was really, really wonderful. And I'm looking forward to next week. Again, if you guys want more information on Willie, there's a link to his blog. A whole lot of very interesting information, and feel free to check it out and have a look. And if you have any questions, let us know. Thank you so much.
For more information about the Bible GPS, please visit our website at thebiblegps.com. Please subscribe to our channel, share the video, like it, and leave us a comment. You can also support our ministry by donating. All the information is in our website. Thank you and God bless.